So you're looking here at several pictures of Indian athlete Dutee Chand. And she was the subject of a lot of controversy because when she started winning races early in her life, she was really starting to win them. Meaning, not only did she won by a large margin. And then she started winning more and more and more. And people started to question, how is she doing this? How is she winning all these races? Well, then the accusations started. People were wondering, is she a woman? Should she be racing with the women? Should she be racing with the men? So lots of questions came up. In fact, she was even suspended from racing for a time during some testing. So this brings up a lot of questions, right? What is sex? What is gender? All of these questions are very complicated. But biology, where we are in biology today, can really give us some information, can shed some light on the question of what is sex, what is gender, what is attraction. So I'm going to, in this video, really go through some of these main topics here, and then we'll sort of talk about how this all relates back to Dutee. Let's get started. So I'm calling this particular slide a rainbow of biology because what we're finding more and more is that biology is a rainbow of colors. Or you could conversely say there's a lot of gray too, right? So biology paints so many different phenotypes or so many different traits and characteristics that sometimes it's hard to really understand what's going on. So in this video, I want to talk about a few things in particular. I want to start by talking about sex, biological sex, and what that means, okay? So sex, in terms of biology, really includes all of these things. What are your chromosomes? What genes on those chromosomes are activated? What about hormone levels? What do the gonads, testes, ovaries look like? What about the external genitalia? What about sexual characteristics that we consider secondary, like breasts or voice? That all falls into a category of what we call biological sex. I then want to move into talking about gender identity. So your own personal sense of your gender. And we know this is all in the brain. And what I will talk about is the difference female and male, some gender identities in that sort of intersexed category, and then some non-binary as well. The third main topic I want to include in this video is attraction. Now, many people, the most common attraction in humans is heterosexuality, but we also know there are many people who identify as homosexual and some even bisexual. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about these three. Now, there are certainly things I'm leaving out, right? I'm not talking about gender expression, okay? I'm not talking about romantic attraction as much as just attraction to sexual beings. So I'm leaving some things out, but I'm going to focus in on these three categories to really go in on this video, okay? So we're going to start with one of the most complicated, which is sex. What is sex? So I mentioned earlier that many biological factors determine sex. We used to think, okay, it's just chromosomes, right? But we now know it's much more complicated. There are genes on chromosomes that also determine sex as well. We'll get into that. We'll also talk about hormones and the role hormones play in the determination of sex. You know, those famous hormones, testosterone, estrogen. How do those play a role? Then, some people say, well, it's all about whether or not you have these internal or external sex organs, right? You have an ovary, you have testes, penis, vagina. What is it? That determines your sex. Well, but what about secondary sexual characteristics, right? A deep voice, breasts in females. So what I want you to get from this first section is that really sex is not binary. It's not just this or this. It's actually a combination of all of these things together that we use in biology to determine what sex is. Whether we're determining sex in a human or we're determining sex in a lobster, we've got to consider all of these characteristics to truly determine sex. All right, so I'm going to go through each of these and give you some examples of when they're atypical or when we see things that are analogous. So let's talk about our typical understanding first. So we have genes on our chromosomes. Most of these sex-linked genes rely on sex chromosomes. And in humans and other mammals, there are two sex chromosomes, X and Y. Typically, females we've identified as having two X, males we identify as having one X and one Y. But what we'll find is that many times this is not the case. So I'm just showing you a little karyotype here. This is the arrangement of what we call the autosomal chromosomes, chromosome 1 through 22, right, are autosomal. These are what make up most of the traits in our body. Most of our sex traits, however, reside on the 23rd pair of chromosomes. And as I mentioned, typically XY is male, typically XX is female. All right, so how are they different? What's on these two chromosomes? Well, the X chromosome is actually pretty long, and we actually know that in addition to sex traits and sex determination, there are many other genes on that X chromosome, right? If you are colorblind, if you have muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, these genes are on the X chromosome. So you see a typical X chromosome here, right? And on each, as you go down the chromosome, you'll see different positions on the chromosome. And then you'll see a sort of narrowing in the center, the centromere. And you can see how many million base pairs. When we talk about base pairs, we're talking about A, T, C, and G, right? The nucleotides, the nitrogenous bases that make up our DNA sequence. And then you can see about how long down at 61 million base pairs, here we are. This one happens to be the X chromosome, about 156 million base pairs in length. Compare that over to the Y chromosome, which we typically find in men, only 57. So this is about a third of the length of the X chromosome. All right, so what's on the Y chromosome? Well, it can't be anything super, super important because, right, most females don't have an X chromosome. So what's on the Y chromosome is what's called the SRY region, or a sex-determining region. This is sort of like a master gene, master regulators for what we consider to be maleness, okay? And in development, these genes will get turned on and then thusly turn on other genes to produce male hormones. So we call this a pleiotropic set of genes because these affect many characteristics of sexual development. Okay, so I've told you what is typical, right? But as we know in biology, just because something is common doesn't mean it's always there. So sometimes there are errors in sex chromosome variation through what we call non-disjunction. All right, so let me give you a reminder of some basic biology. When meiosis is happening, remember meiosis is what makes the gametes, the sperm and the egg. So meiosis, what typically happens is when you're making sperm or egg, all your chromosomes line up in the middle, and often, mostly, right, the chromosomes split effectively. So one egg cell gets these, one egg cell gets these. Notice these might be slightly different. You might have certain traits here that are not in this particular chromosome, because remember, humans have two of each chromosome. So you get one of the two that you have to go in your egg, which is why children don't have every single trait of their parents. They get half from mom, half from dad. So, however, on occasion, there's an error in meiosis, right? So what happens is, if these don't separate properly, we call this a non-disjunction. Now notice what happens. When this separates, notice that this egg has more chromosomes than this. This one's actually missing a chromosome when you look at here. So this has got the typical number of chromosomes you have plus 1. This would be the typical number of chromosomes you have minus 1. Now, this is what causes things like Down syndrome, right? If it's the 21st chromosome in humans, a non-disjunction could result in Down syndrome. When this happens in our sex chromosomes, we get all sorts of really interesting things that happen. So, what I want you to take away from this is that sex chromosomes do not dictate a binary system, right? We think of binary, think of zeros and ones. It's this or this, this or this. Well, it's not always X or Y, or X and X. Sometimes we get lots of different conditions. One example is Klinefelter syndrome, when there's a non-disjunction and males are born with an extra X. So they have two X's and a Y. Here's someone with Klinefelter syndrome. Most of these males are sterile. Many of them will develop breasts. So they might have what some consider to be feminine characteristics. Still male, technically, because of this Y chromosome, or at least in our modern understanding. Trisomy X, a female can have an extra X. This normally doesn't matter because some of these X's, because there's redundancy, condense into what we call bar bodies. So that's really not ever an issue if you have trisomy X. Jacob syndrome is when there's an extra Y. So a man is not XY, it's XYY, so an extra Y. And we see some really interesting effects with the testosterone levels of some people that have Jacob syndrome. Another example is a female who only has one X, right? Didn't get the two X's, only has one, and we call that Turner syndrome, okay? So we see lots of different cases of sex. So once again, what do we classify people? Male, female? Well, it's so much more complicated than just looking at chromosomes, because often chromosomes are not this binary system that we've come to think of. Now, in addition to having too many, too few chromosomes, you can actually have chromosomes that don't have the same genes. Let me give you an example. So we would say these are changing part of a chromosome. So there's something called XX male syndrome. This is when males, people who we typically identify as a male, actually has two X chromosomes. How does that happen? How does a person have two X chromosomes but be phenotypically male? Well, this is actually caused from an issue in crossing over in meiosis in the father. And what happens is there's this time in prophase 1 of meiosis when sometimes chromosomes cross over. So if you're a male, if you're a dad, occasionally part of this chromosome, because they're so close, overlaps with part of this chromosome, and this region of the chromosome, it's actually this one, moves over. We call that crossing over. We see this a lot. It increases genetic variation in many species. So then, basically what they're doing is they're exchanging genetic information. What we know is what's at the end of this chromosome, as I told you earlier, was that SRY region. So what happens is that some people with XX chromosomes, so we would typically think as female, actually get the SRY region from the Y chromosome. They don't have a Y chromosome, they just got these few genes from the Y chromosome, and they cross over. So you see the SRY region here, which was on a Y chromosome, actually goes to an X. So we have an example here, again, of someone born with two X chromosomes. So if we were just saying, all women have XX and all men have XY, well, that's just naive, because you can have XX chromosome and have the region which causes maleness, okay? So again, it's gray, it's complicated, it's a rainbow of a lot of different things that can happen. These people can have typical male genitalia, right? Testes, penis, or they can have what we call genital ambiguity, meaning it's kind of ambiguous. It's maybe a little bit of what we call an ovotesty, perhaps, a little bit of ovary, a little bit of testes, maybe sort of an inverted penis. It just kind of depends. Each case is slightly different. Okay, another really interesting thing we see in biology is what we call gonadromorphism. And that is when an animal exhibits both male and female characteristics. So take, for example, we have this particular butterfly, a female Papilio androgus. And what you see, and I left out, I guess I got a little space there. This is the female. Here's a mosaic, and here's a male. So here's something that's interesting that happens. here's the female, here's the male. But occasionally we have insects, animals that are born half female, half male. We call those gonadromorphs. And so what you can see here is that half male, half female, this is actually caused by an error in mitosis. So the other things we were looking at were often errors in meiosis. This is actually after meiosis has happened, the embryo's developing, then there's an error later on in mitosis. So what happens is, sometimes when mitosis is happening, the chromosomes line up in the center. Sometimes during mitosis, the chromosomes don't separate properly. So you've got this cluster of cells over here that have got one X, so we might consider that female. We've got this cluster of cells over here that develop X and Y. You might consider that the male side. Well, as we know, when we're an embryo, when we're small, when we're just a few cells, those early cells, where we're very early in our development, those early cells then turn into all of our other cells as we grow to be adults. And so part of these animals develop to be what we might consider female, some what we might consider to be male. Here's a very striking example. There's a lobster, that's a gonadromorph. We have part of the lobster female, part of the lobster male. And this is showing amazing bilateral symmetry to see this part female, part male, okay? So once again, male, female, well, in between, intersexed, we see lots of really interesting examples. Now, we don't typically see, or actually, I don't know any examples where we've seen gonadromorphism in humans, but we definitely see it in many other animal species. Another really interesting idea of sex are hermaphrodites. So these are animals that have reproductive organs of both sexes. So they can produce both male and female gametes, both egg and sperm. Now you think of like earthworms, they're what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites, meaning simultaneously at the same time, they have both sex organs. So if you're an earthworm, you're I don't know, worming through the earth, as your name implies, then you find another earthworm, doesn't matter if it's male or female, because all earthworms are hermaphrodites, they can mate with each other. Now, there are other types of hermaphrodites, which I find to be really interesting, which we call sequential. These are when an individual is born as one sex, but later undergoes sex change into another sex. Prime example are sort of like anemone fish, examples of clownfish, right? Where you typically only have one female in the group that's the mating female. Now, then you would have, of course, the males, often smaller, but one of the males, the bigger male, would sort of be the alpha male. That's the one that mates. Then you have these other sort of indistinguished males. Now, well, what happens if there's only one female? What happens when the female dies? Well, what we know is the alpha becomes the female. They transition into being the female, and when sort of the beta males will transition into being the alpha. So a really interesting thing that happens in some animals where they literally change the sex. So they've got the genetics, they've got the genetic makeup, the chromosomes to be both, and it is sequential in some. So I don't want to ruin any of your childhood, but those of you who are big fans of Nemo, Finding Nemo, right? Technically that's a little incorrect, because what would have happened when Nemo's mom died is Nemo's dad, let's say this one, would have actually converted to being the female. So the whole bit with his dad going through the, well, it would have been his mom, but yeah, there you go, Hollywood. Okay, so that's hermaphroditism. Now, then, often the question I get when I'm lecturing on this is, what about humans? Well, we do know that there are some human-born hermaphrodites. Now we really use the term intersexed. This is a person who sort of has both male and female biological characteristics. So, people that are human hermaphrodites or intersexed can have both gonadal tissues, and gonads, we're talking about testes, ovaries, and they can have difference in their external genitals, in the penile and vaginal tissue as well. So I've got a chart here that I made. It's very complicated. I just want to hit a few things just so that you see the beautiful diversity that we can get in humans. So one example, and I've outlined this, remember I told you, sex is all about genes, it's all about hormones, it's about organs, and about sexual sex characteristics. So when you take everything into account, that could help you determine sex. So one example is 45X, 45XY mosaicism. If you have a mosaic, right, it's a bunch of different pieces together. And so when we have mosaicism, we have different chromosomal genes that have been sort of put together in a mosaic, right? So these people only have 45 instead of the typical 46 human chromosomes. And what happens? Well, we get atypical amounts of testosterone, and we get mixed gonadal dysgenesis, meaning that genesis, right, the development of, and this is a dys, meaning an abnormal development. So, and often these people would have one testes and then one sort of anomalous gland. Anomalous meaning non-typical or not common. So you might have one testes, one ovary. You might have one testes and then one underdeveloped testes. Then these folks often will develop breasts because of the atypical amounts of testosterone, okay? Another really interesting one, and I'm going to go over more of this in the next slide, is 46XY. So these would be people that we would typically think are males, an X and a Y chromosome, all 46, but they have a mutation in SRD5A2. What that does is it produces low amounts of dihydrotestosterone. And I'm going to go over really what's happening in a moment in more detail in this. But this has male gonads, right, male testes, but often ambiguous genitals. Or sometimes female external genitals and male internal. After puberty, then these folks often develop into males or identify as males, even though they may have been labeled early on as females. We also have over here 46XY, so normal number of chromosomes, but a gene mutation in the androgen sensitivity gene, which makes different cells resistant to male hormones. So we get ambiguous genitals, we may see development of breasts on this male. Really interesting things that happen. And then, of course, I've already been over Klinefelters, where there's an extra X. So we see low testosterone, male internal and external sex organs, but small testes, maybe infertility, and you might see some breast development. So, again, in all of this, what we're looking at is such a rainbow and amalgamation of so many genes and chromosomes and hormones all working together in your body to produce sort of the sexual characteristics. All right, so I want to go over this particular one when I was talking about 46XY males, because if you go along with sort of this old, outdated notion that all males are XY and all females are only XX, right? Which is just naive at best. What you find is that this is not the case at all here. So this person, a person that is 46XY, has 23 pairs and 1 X, 1 Y. So we would have, typically, if we're just looking at chromosomes, we would label them male. However, we notice that there is a mutation which causes an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. We know it's an enzyme, it ends in ASE, to be deficient. And as I'm going to show you here, 5-alpha reductase enzyme converts testosterone, which we think of as the male sex hormone, into dihydroxytestosterone, which then goes through a pathway, as you'll see here, into the nucleus, going to specific target genes for androgens, and plays a role in transcribing and translating those genes into proteins. Well, if this enzyme is deficient, the testosterone doesn't get converted to dihydroxytestosterone, and we don't get all this development of what we consider to be male characteristics. So most people that are 46XY are actually assigned female at birth by their doctors, right? Look female, sort of ambiguous genitalia. But then when puberty happens and there's a surge of testosterone, well now, even though we're deficient in 5-alpha reductase, we'll still see, because of the surge, an increase of the production of these male phenotypic proteins. Okay? So, prime example of the chromosomes being different than the phenotypic expression. Okay, so I've talked a lot about sex, biological sex. Hopefully you're starting to understand that biological sex is about chromosomes and genes on chromosomes and hormones and sexual characteristics. I now want to move into talking to something which is a little more difficult to understand where we are in science. But I'm going to try my best to give you an understanding of what gender identity is. So if you think about it, humans are kind of unique because if you're a lobster, you're not thinking, oh, I'm a male or I'm a female, right? They don't really have a gender identity. Humans are different. Because of our developed brains, we have this identity of who we are in terms of our gender. So gender is really a personal sense of my own gender. So when I go to sleep, for me personally, I feel I'm a male. In my brain feels male. That's my gender identity. Some people go to bed, they feel they're female. So if someone's brain matches their body sex, or their sex assigned at birth, which we've just talked about is not easy to determine at all, then that person would be cisgendered, right? So their biological sex or their sex assigned at birth matches their brain. Transgender would be when someone's brain, their identity of themselves, is different than perhaps their biological manifestations of gender. And then we talked about all those categories of intersex where there's the biology is actually somewhere in between male, female. And then there's a category of those who are non-binary who feel they are neither or some combination, or they're just not on, they don't want to label where they are. A lot of people have a hard time understanding this, so I'm going to do my best to explain it the way I think of it. So if you've been watching my whole series, I talk a lot about consciousness, right? And to create consciousness in your brain, right, we're conscious beings, there's really a few things we're doing. Because after all, where's your brain? Locked in a cranium. Does your brain have any interaction with the world itself? No. It just relies on eyes to transmit a signal to the brain so I can see. It relies on ears to transmit waves of sound to my brain so I can hear. What about things going on in your body? Well, same thing. To create consciousness, we have an experience of the world through our senses. Oh, that tastes good. Oh, that sounds bad. Oh, I see that thing. But we also have an internal thing happening, right? We have an experience of ourself, what it means to be me, right? My consciousness of me, of Brandon, is very different from the conscious experience of what it means to be you, whoever you are. These two things together, right? Experience of ourself. Oh, I'm in love. I'm hungry. How do you know you're hungry? Your body tells you you're hungry. How do you know you're in love? Your body tells you, right? Or if you're anxious, why are you anxious? Because there's these bodily signals going to the brain and telling you these things. Because after all, you are your brain. Your brain is locked inside a skull. So to experience the world, to experience consciousness, I have to rely on signals coming from my body or from the world. Those collectively make our consciousness. I believe strongly that gender identity is part of our consciousness. If I identify as a male, if I go to sleep as a male, that's part of my consciousness based on a few things. Experience of the world. I could look down and maybe see my male or female characteristics, but there's also an experience in my body, in my brain, that's also telling me what my perception of myself is, right? Because your brain is you, and your brain is identifying who you are. So, I like to think of gender identity as the experience from my body and brain that identifies my gender. That doesn't always line up with what the world might experience as my gender as well. Hopefully that helped you. That's kind of how I see this. So that was a little philosophical. Let me get a little scientific now. We do know biologically there's a lot going on. If you think about your DNA, right? Your DNA controls development because after all, what are you? You're just a product of your code, your DNA, right? When mom and dad got together to make you, half mom's DNA, half dad's DNA comes together to make your whole set of DNA. Well, when you're a tiny little embryo, right, your DNA starts to develop you. Well, what do we know? Different parts of the body develop at different times. So, for example, your brain is developing at a certain time, and then you go through lots of things, neurulation, gastrulation. There are all these, and if you study human development, you can look at all the different things happening as you develop, as you grow from one cell into billions. And the brain is developing up here. Gonads, legs, other parts are developing in different places, but all of that is really controlled by this DNA, right? Well, so what happens is the brain, when it's developing, doesn't have to look down, right? It doesn't have eyes. It's a brain. It doesn't look down at your gonads and say, oh, penis must be male, right? Testes must be male, right? It's so much more complex than that, right? There's so many more things beyond chromosomes and hormones and different genes that control our gender. And the brain developing on its own as well in play, right? I'm not saying that these things are totally separate because these hormones that are there from these master regulator genes are also developing not only the brain, but also the gonads. But it's not like one is relying on the other to develop. So it's easier to understand that the brain could develop an identity while the rest of the body displays different phenotypic gender characteristics. A really interesting study, when a lot of people are asking, well, is transgenderism or cisgenderism, is that biological? Well, yes, it is biological, right? First of all, everything's biological. In everything that's living is biological. And here's an interesting study that was done. In 20% of monozygotic twins, that's when one egg, so these are identical, one egg and sperm go together, and then after a while they split into two. So basically, they're the exact same genes, exact same DNA. 20% of monozygotic twins that are transgender, the other twin is also transgender. And you may say, oh, well, just 20%, that's 1 in 5, that's not very much. But when you compare it to the non-identical twins, at only 2%, that's a huge statistical difference when we're comparing 2 to 20. So this shows us that there is probably a genetic component to transgenderism, or the effect or the property of being transgender. Okay, so I now want to talk a little bit about this biology, right? What specifically is happening? What are some studies showing us? Well, there's been a lot of studies done on chromosome 19, right? Is there a gene to make someone transgender? So we've done a lot of studies, and we see that on chromosome 19, there's something which we call a repeat length polymorphism. So in other words, on chromosome 19 in a certain region, in a certain gene, there's this repeat of this particular polymorphism over and over again, all these nucleotides that are repeated. And that's associated with trans women. So what we find is this NR3C4 receptor that's crucial in forming these characteristics is affected. So you've seen sort of this little image before. I know this looks scary. Let me walk you through it. Remember, testosterone comes in, an enzyme, 5-alpha reductase, converts it to dihydroxytestosterone. Here you have the androgen receptor. Once this occurs, right, once this has then bound to the androgen receptor, we get some phosphorylations happening, moves in to the nucleus, which then, through some dimerizations and some phosphorylations, starts transcription, we see the enhancer region here, of a particular genes that are used to transcribe for our primary and secondary sexual characteristics, okay? So if there is a variant in this gene, you can see how it's going to affect these proteins being made. We also know that for trans men, there is a variant on chromosome 17 on this particular CYP gene that's linked to being transsexual in trans men. And what we see is that this gene codes for the enzyme involved with the sex hormone progesterone. So you've probably heard about progesterone, progestin in females. Well, what we see here is that there's actually a variant in the gene. So we see here that this enzyme, 3-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, actually there's a variant. And what that enzyme does, as you can see, takes a precursor progesterone, this chemical here, right? Here's a little biochemistry, a little organic chemistry for you, which was converted from cholesterol. So cholesterol goes to this, pregnenolone goes to progesterone with the help of this particular steroid. Well, if that steroid is a variant, then we're going to see some different outcomes phenotypically. All right, so I've tried to talk to you a little bit about sex. It's complicated. Gender identity, it's complicated. And also now I'm going to talk about sexual attraction or sexual orientation. Once again, it's complicated. So I'm going to focus on these 3 types of sexual orientation or attraction. There are many more, but for time, I'm just going to focus on these 3. Heterosexuality, as you know, is one male, one female, and we see that in roughly 80 to 90% of the human population. Homosexual is, think homo, same. So this is when someone is attracted to the same sex. We see that in roughly 10 to 15%. Bisexuality is when there is a preference for both. Now, do we see this anywhere besides humans? Well, absolutely. We actually have documented homosexuality in over 1,500 species. That's just what we've documented it in, right? It's in many more that are undocumented as well, I'm sure. So another example I wanted to bring up to you is our friend the bonobo monkeys, which happen to be our closest living ancestral relative, right? We evolved from a similar, or we have a common ancestor with them. And in fact, bonobo monkeys are almost exclusively homosexual, meaning the males mate with the males, the females mate with the females, except to mate. So you might be thinking, well, that doesn't make sense evolutionarily speaking. Why do they do that? Well, what many people have, the people that research bonobos, is that they've noticed this actually bonds the females together, right? And instead of fighting and going to war, the homosexuality in males, instead of fighting, they're making love, right? So we see different types of sexual orientations throughout the animal world. Well, what about in humans? What do the studies show? Well, a really interesting study that was done in 1997 linked fraternal birth order, right? So the birth of males and the order of their birth. And what this study showed was that every time a mother has another male son, then the likelihood of that male being gay increases by 33%. And they link it to this particular chemical called anti-NLG4Y, which is a neuroligand. It's involved in cell-to-cell communication levels. And they actually have linked it to that. So here's the study. Basically what they're saying is the more males a mother has, the higher this anti-neuroligand production goes up. And this anti-neuroligand production is associated with homosexuality in males. So if you have 5 older brothers, your likelihood of being homosexual gay increases significantly. Now, what about chromosomes? Where is it on the chromosome? Everybody wants to find a gene for everything, right? Right? Where's the gene? What's my gene for eye color? What's my gene for this? Well, it's not that simple, right? Even eye color is not that simple. We know eye color is something which is what we call polygenic, meaning many genes contribute to our eye color. Well, the same occurs in sexuality. It's many, many genes working together to produce our sexual orientations. So we think there's a big X-linked component, so we think there's a lot on the X chromosome. But we think also, in all likelihood, this is polygenic and X-linked. Why do we know that? Because we look at lots of studies, and there have been many, I'm going to show a few, to tell us where there are some commonalities in our chromosomes. So lots of studies like I showed you. And all of these, what you see here, are kind of linked to the X chromosome. And so, and you can see the years all these studies were done. And some of them were done in humans, some of them were done in mice. We can actually change the sexual preference of mice. We can actually change the sexual preference of flies, right? I've done this before. Put a little chemical in with some flies, and all of a sudden they start mating with the same sex. And we see some polymorphisms, again, in some genes. So, like most of our traits, sexual orientation and attraction is polygenic. And I've listed a list here for you. I've taken a picture of a list that tells you many of the studies and where we think these chromosomes are. So on X, chromosome 1, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. We have done studies on all of these chromosomes. So we think there are genes on all of these chromosomes together that affect the overall portrait of our sexuality. The best example I can give you is one of these genes is an instrument. Another is another instrument. So think of an orchestra, a symphony. Yeah, you're going to have one violin playing, and it might be expressing itself. But really, to get the whole symphony, to understand the whole beautiful rainbow of sound in a symphony, you have to have all the instruments playing together. And that's what's really happening in our bodies. It's really all the genes playing together to create the beautiful song that is our sexuality. Okay, I know that got a little cheesy there, but that's what I think. Last little study I want to bring up was one that was done at my alma mater. I got to give a shout out, and to Harvard. That was done that compared, it was sort of a global comparison study. And what it did is it used DNA from 23andMe and the UK Biobank. So you've probably heard of 23andMe, right? I actually did it. You swab your mouth, you send it. Then they tell you about all these traits you have. So what they did is they compared the genes to see if there was any correlation between certain chromosomes and gay people or heterosexual people. And what they found, and this is very hard to read, I understand. I'm going to sort of help you out. Here are the chromosomes at the bottom, and then here's a p-value based on a log 10 scale over here. Now, if you look, combined for same sexual behavior for both combined female and males, chromosome 7, there's a very strong linkage that pops up, very strong correlation. For male specific, there's one on chromosome 11, one on chromosome 15, right? And another combined. For females, there's one closer down here on the 4th. So this is a really fascinating study because they're literally using hundreds of thousands of participants to see, okay, this participant claimed they were homosexual, this one did too. Let's see where their DNA matches. And they found these really interesting genes. So once again, this is linking back to this idea that sexual orientation is genetic, but it's polygenetic, many genes contributing to our sexual orientation. All right, let's go back. Where does this leave Duty, right? Well, what we now know is that Duty had hyperandrogenism. So she produced excess testosterone, which we typically associate with male athletes. So, she a woman? She a male? Well, it goes back to our definition, right? What does it mean to be female? Well, 2 X chromosomes, yes, check, female. Female genitalia, yes. Absence of male genitalia, female, yes. Assigned female at birth. Low levels of testosterone, that's the one that she didn't have. Attracted to men, actually we found out later that she was not. She happens to be lesbian. Hopefully what this is telling you, though, is that this is all so complicated. And when we're going to assign gender, it is so important to consider all of these traits instead of this sort of binary system. All right, so let me be philosophical here at the end. Humans are the only ones that care about this, right? And the universe doesn't care. Biology doesn't care. Evolution really doesn't seem to care. It's humans. So is she evil because of her different testosterone? That's ridiculous, right? She has endured so much, this person, right? Ridicule, being ousted by her community because of biology, right? Because of the universe, and they don't care. It's just us that cares. So I always like to, when I think about people and things, I have in my personal life moved beyond what we just want as tolerance, right? Everyone's like, oh, we need tolerance. I've moved beyond tolerance. Why wouldn't I tolerate someone just because of different testosterone? I've even moved beyond acceptance. Of course I accept biology. No one has a role in their biology, their brain development. I personally think, and I think for humanity, we should move to celebration. Because as a biologist, I celebrate the rainbow of amazing diversity in our genes. I celebrate this rainbow of sexuality, of sexual orientation, of gender identity, because it was biology, it was the universe that put this all together and keeps us going. So wherever you fall and wherever you are in understanding all of this, for me personally, as a biologist of many, many years, I always hope that I tend to lean more towards celebration of biology than condemnation of biology.